Listen carefully. What I am about to tell you was never meant to survive the men who created it. It was whispered into ledgers, buried in ash, and disguised as routine. If the story unsettles you, that is not an accident. Unease is the body remembering something the mind was trained to forget. For 37 years, a man lived inside a system designed not just to break bodies but to study the exact moment a human spirit bends. His name does not matter as much as what he saw, because what he witnessed was not slavery as it is politely summarized in textbooks. It was something colder, more deliberate, a laboratory disguised as a plantation, a place where suffering was not merely inflicted but measured. Imagine being watched your entire life, not supervised, watched, every habit noted, every bond recorded, every loss analyzed for efficiency. This was not chaos. This was order. And order is always more terrifying than cruelty. The plantation sat along a river that looked peaceful enough to fool the untrained eye. White columns, quiet fields, respectable neighbors. But beneath that calm exterior operated a system of silent experimentation. Men with education, men with journals, men who believed they were discovering truths about human nature by owning it. The man whose testimony guides this descent was taken as a child. He did not understand at first that he was not just property. He was data. His family was data. Their love, their grief, their endurance, all variables in an equation written by men who believed God had appointed them observers of human limits. He remembers the journal before he remembers the whippings. A leather-bound book carried everywhere by the master of the house. The pencil sharpened daily. Pages filled not with rage, but with curiosity. How long before exhaustion? How much loss before obedience? How much hope before rebellion? This is how systems truly control men. Not through constant violence but through surveillance, calculation, and the slow removal of meaning. You are not beaten every day. You are watched every day. And that changes you far more deeply. Official records say the plantation prospered, struggled, and eventually disappeared in a fire. What they do not say is why people vanished without explanation, why graves went unmarked, why entire families were erased from memory as if they had never existed. The man telling this story survived long enough to understand the truth. History is not written by the powerful alone. It is edited by them. And what you are about to hear is one of the edits they never intended to be reversed. Once you hear it, you cannot unknow it. As the boy grew, he began to notice patterns that no child should ever have to recognize. People did not simply die on that land. They were removed. Their absence followed rules. Timing, ratios, a disappearance here, a burial there, always followed by long nights of lamplight in the master's study, pages turning, pencil scratching, calculations being refined. This was not impulsive brutality. This was research. The plantation owner believed himself a rational man trapped by economic forces. Cotton prices fell. Creditors circled.
Pride demandait de solutions.
And when profit faltered, curiosity took over. If labor was failing, perhaps the problem was not the system but the human material inside it. That was the premise. And from that premise, everything else followed. The boy learned early that attention was dangerous. To be noticed was to be measured. To be measured was to be tested. The master watched how men worked after punishment versus after loss. He observed which grief produced silence and which produced defiance. He noted how hunger sharpened obedience, how separation weakened resistance. Families were not sacred bonds here, they were leverage points. When one man vanished, the others were forced to search. Not to find him but to absorb the lesson. When a body appeared days later in the river, the explanation was always the same. Escape attempt, recklessness, nature's fault. But the master's hands shook when he spoke those words. Not from guilt but from variables he could not fully control. The boy saw where the master's eyes drifted during those moments. Toward the eastern ridge. toward the fenced ground where the family buried its own while others were interred without names, without markers, without acknowledgement. Death itself was stratified. Fear was cultivated carefully, not enough to cause collapse, enough to cause compliance. And compliance, the master believed, could be optimized. Years passed. The watching intensified. A doctor arrived one season not to heal but to classify. Skulls measured. Pain thresholds tested. Reflexes timed. Questions asked about dreams, fears, lineage. The master stood beside him, recording everything. Two educated men discussing whether suffering registered the same way in different kinds of humans. This is how evil survives respectably. It dresses itself as inquiry. It speaks in clinical language. It claims neutrality while deciding who qualifies as fully human. The boy, now old enough to read, saw the truth written plainly in ink. They were not managing labor. They were building a manual. A guide for how to own people more efficiently, how to extract maximum output with minimal rebellion. And once you understand that, once you see how suffering becomes data, you begin to recognize the pattern everywhere else history refuses to look. The most dangerous moment in any system of control is when the subject begins to understand the system. That is why knowledge was forbidden. That is why literacy was feared. And that is why the master made one fatal miscalculation: he allowed the wrong eyes to read the wrong pages. By adolescence, the boy was assisting with records, numbers, inventories, journals. And within those pages, he discovered something far worse than cruelty. He discovered intention. The master was not improvising. He was refining. Every loss was annotated. Every death contextualized. When a sister disappeared, the river was blamed publicly, but the private notes told another story. Footprints recorded. Resistance assessed. Maternal grief measured in productivity decline. Emotional attachment identified as a vulnerability. The boy's father asked questions. Questions are intolerable in closed systems. 2 weeks later, he was sold south. Not punished. Removed. Erased. Separation was cleaner than execution. No martyrs. No witnesses. Just silence. This is how power disciplines inquiry. Not with spectacle but with disappearance. The journals grew thicker. The conclusions sharper. Stress thresholds. Recovery timelines. Optimal despair-to-hope ratios. The language was mechanical, but the implications were spiritual. They were mapping the soul the way an engineer maps terrain, looking for load limits, fracture points, failure rates. A second doctor corresponded by letter, praising the plantation's meticulous observations, encouraging continued experimentation. The boy read those letters too, learned that what was happening on that quiet riverbank was feeding a broader intellectual movement, one that sought to justify ownership not as law, but as nature. This is the truth most people cannot sit with. Atrocities rarely exist in isolation. They require networks, validation, peer review. And once an idea is validated, it spreads quietly into policy, into institutions, into assumptions that outlive the men who first wrote them down. The plantation burned years later. Officially an accident. Records lost. Convenient. But the knowledge survived elsewhere, in books, in doctrines, in management philosophies stripped of their origin stories. The boy lived long enough to understand that what broke his family was not just slavery. It was an early version of something much larger. A system that studies humans not to liberate them but to control them better next time. And once you recognize that pattern, you begin to see its descendants everywhere. There is a moment in every descent where denial becomes impossible. For the man who survived 37 years inside that system, it came when he realized the experiments were no longer limited to punishment or loss but extended into belief itself. They were not just controlling bodies. They were attempting to reprogram identity. Faith gatherings were monitored. Songs were cataloged. Stories passed between the enslaved were quietly discouraged, not through bans, but through exhaustion. Too tired to remember. Too watched to speak freely. Even hope was rationed. The master understood something most tyrants eventually learn. A man who understands himself is harder to own. So the system worked to fracture self-concept. You were not a father, you were breeding stock. Not a mother, you were a labor unit. Not a man, you were a variable. This is where the knowledge becomes dangerous. Because this technique did not die with plantations. It evolved. Modern systems still track output, compliance, emotional resilience. They still separate families, sometimes physically, sometimes psychologically. They still label human beings as resources, metrics, demographics. The language changed. The function did not. If this realization is landing heavy, it should. Because halfway through this descent, you must make a choice. You can consume this as history, or you can recognize it as a warning. Right now, I want you to pause and do something intentional. In the comments, write this phrase twice, exactly twice. I see the ledger. I see the ledger. This is not superstition. It is declaration. You are signaling that you recognize how systems track, test, and condition human behavior. That you are no longer pretending not to see it. The man whose testimony guides this story believed that awareness was the only form of freedom he would ever touch. They could own his body but not his understanding. And understanding, once activated, spreads. After decades of observation, he realized the cruelest outcome was not the deaths. It was the replication. The way methods refined in darkness reemerged later in brighter rooms under cleaner names. Efficiency, optimization, behavioral management, different words, same ledger. And once you know that ledger exists, you start noticing who is holding the pencil. By the final years of his captivity, the man understood something most never articulate. Systems of domination do not collapse from outrage. They collapse from exposure. Not emotional exposure, but structural exposure. Seeing how the machine actually works. The plantation eventually failed. Fire erased the buildings. Debt consumed the family. The journals vanished. But the methodology had already escaped the property line. It had been shared, discussed, refined elsewhere, detached from its original victims. That is the real horror of suppressed history. Not that it is hidden, but that it is reused. When freedom finally came, it arrived quietly.
No ceremony.
No justice. Just a document and a road leading away from the river that had swallowed so many explanations. The man carried no proof with him, only memory. And memory, in a world that demands paperwork, is always treated as unreliable. So he waited. Decades passed. He watched new institutions rise, new forms of classification, new ways of talking about people as problems to be managed rather than lives to be honored. And he recognized the same handwriting even when the ink had changed. This testimony is not about the past alone. It is about pattern recognition, about understanding that the most effective chains are invisible, that the most powerful prisons are psychological, that the most dangerous experiments are the ones conducted quietly, legally, and with professional language. The man spoke before he died because silence protects systems, not victims. And once a system is named, it loses some of its power. You were never meant to hear the story framed this way. Not because it is false, but because it is too accurate. It forces a question most people avoid. If they studied human suffering then, what are they studying now? This knowledge does not make you afraid. It makes you alert. And alert men are difficult to program. The descent is not over. There are deeper layers, still connections that stretch beyond one plantation, beyond one century. But now you understand the foundation. This was never just about slavery. It was about control. And control, once perfected, never stops looking for new subjects. By the time the man reached old age, he understood that the plantation had been a prototype. A contained environment where power could observe human behavior under pressure without interference. What frightened him most was not what happened there, but how portable it all was. Remove the chains. Keep the ratios. Remove the whips. Keep the surveillance. Remove the overseer. Replace him with policy, paperwork, and incentives. The structure survives. He noticed how institutions learned to extract obedience without overt violence. How men could be guided into compliance by debt instead of threat. How fear could be induced not by punishment but by uncertainty. Never knowing when rules would change. Never knowing which mistake would be fatal to your livelihood. This is what the journals were really about. Predictability. If you can predict a man's breaking point, you can design a system that never has to break him publicly. You can keep him functional, productive, quiet. The plantation taught its architects that despair must be carefully managed. Too much and men revolt. Too little and they dream. The optimal state is fatigue mixed with hope, just enough belief in improvement to prevent resistance, just enough exhaustion to prevent escape. The man recognized this pattern later in factories, in bureaucracies, in institutions that claimed to serve the public good while quietly cataloging behavior. Metrics replaced chains. Compliance training replaced punishment. But the underlying logic remained untouched. What disturbed him most was how willingly people participated once the system convinced them it was normal. That suffering, when standardized, becomes invisible. That when everyone is measured, no one feels targeted. This is why forbidden history matters. Not because it shames the past, but because it reveals the architecture of control that survives it. Without that awareness, men mistake convenience for freedom, structure for safety, permission for autonomy. The plantation did not need monsters. It needed clerks, accountants, doctors, men who could look at a human being and see a case study instead of a soul. And that, the man realized, was the true inheritance of those years. Not trauma but a warning encoded in experience. A map of how power behaves when it believes it will never be questioned. Once you see that map, you start noticing how often it is reused. Toward the end of his life, the man spoke less about pain and more about memory. Because memory, he learned, is the final battleground. Control the narrative and you control the lesson. Reduce the story to cruelty alone, and you hide the intelligence behind it. That is why history prefers villains to systems. Villains can be condemned. Systems can be replicated. He knew the plantation owners would be remembered, if at all, as relics of a barbaric era. What would not be remembered was their methodology, the careful observation, the data-driven cruelty, the belief that humans could be engineered into compliance. That belief did not die in the 1800s. It matured. The man warned that future generations would face chains they could not see. That men would be told they were free while being tracked more closely than any slave had been. That identity itself would become a product shaped, nudged, optimized. He said the most effective control systems never announce themselves. They convince you that your limitations are personal failures, not structural designs. That exhaustion is weakness. That anxiety is individual, not induced. The plantation taught him this. When a system wants to remain invisible, it encourages self-blame. If you are always fixing yourself, you never question the environment. This is why awakening feels dangerous. Because it threatens not one institution but the principle they all rely on: unconscious participation. The man did not believe everyone needed to rebel. He believed they needed to see. Seeing changes posture. It changes how you listen. It changes what you tolerate. Once a man understands how power studies him, he becomes harder to study, harder to predict, harder to reduce to a variable. That is why this knowledge was never meant to circulate freely. Because it produces men who ask different questions. Men who notice patterns instead of headlines. Men who understand that freedom is not granted, it is recognized. And recognition is contagious. This is where the descent ends and where responsibility begins. The man's testimony is not asking for pity. It is issuing a challenge. If systems of control were refined in darkness once, they will be refined again wherever darkness is tolerated. Silence is not neutrality. It is cooperation by default. You live in a world shaped by ledgers you have never seen. Decisions made by people you will never meet. Models built on behavior collected quietly, legally, efficiently. That does not mean you are powerless. It means awareness is the first act of resistance. The plantation burned. The journals vanished. But the logic survived because it was never confronted, only rebranded. And rebranded systems thrive on forgetfulness. You were not meant to connect these dots. You were meant to consume history as entertainment, pain as spectacle, slavery as something finished, contained, resolved. But control does not retire. It adapts. This knowledge changes a man because it removes illusions. It teaches him to ask not just who benefits but how compliance is manufactured. Not just what is happening but what is being measured. The man died knowing he could not dismantle the systems he had witnessed. But he could leave behind a lens. And a lens, once passed on, outlives any institution. If the story unsettled you, that is because part of you recognizes its relevance. Not to the past but to now. To how power still thinks, still observes, still records. The descent ends here. The seeing does not. What you do with that sight determines whether this knowledge remains forbidden or becomes foundational. And remember this above all else. The most dangerous systems are not the ones that hurt openly. They are the ones that convince you nothing is happening at all.